Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another roundtable of the History and Culture Cluster here at Nickel and Dime, an initiative by the Center for New Economic Studies. The theme that we've chosen to explore for the month of April is the silences of history. And we've tried to tackle a variety of silences that essentially either have been erased or just have not been shined a lot of light on or have been misinterpreted with time. And we're hoping to get a good discussion out of today. If everyone can just go ahead with a round of introductions, we'll dive in. Aditi, why don't you go first?
Hi guys, I'm Aditi Lazarus. I'm in my second year of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy from the School of International Affairs. I'm very pleased to be here, and so far, I think the theme silences in history is very interesting. I can't wait to dive deep into it.
That's great. Apurva, how about you go next?
I'm Apurva. I'm studying in first year of BBLLB in General Law School, and I think this month's theme made me dive deeper into Indian histories and taught me a lot about my own culture, which was really great.
Great. How about you, Purvanshi?
Hi, I'm Purvanshi. I'm a second year global affairs student, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think it's a very important topic to discuss.
Amazing. And Sujal, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Sujal Bamil. I have just graduated from Jindal Global Law School from BA Legal Studies, and today's topic is very enriching and very important. So I'm hoping to find like good brainstorming ideas about this.
Okay, that's great. Let's dive into the first question of the evening. And I want to ask Sujal this. What do you think constitutes a historical silence? And how do we distinguish between what is forgotten, omitted, and something that's actively erased?
I think historical silence is something which is a dark part of history, wherein the literature and the journals and the documents and the basic narrative about that part of past is muddy, missing, or it has some problems in it. And actively differentiating between the three categories mentioned, the forgotten, the omitted, and the actively erased. Actively erased, I'd rather rephrase that as covered up because that's a more apt term for it. And first of all, we need to get this right off the bat that history is written by the victors. For example, the Allies in the in World War II, when they won, ever since we have been looking at history in such a way which has also shaped the political narrative of today. As the United States was the country who bombed Japan. So that's like the ultimate crime you can commit. But still, they are the world power today, and they hold global political power today. So why is that? Because they won the war, and that's how they shaped the narrative. You look at Russia; they lost the war, but now, right now, they're at an even worse place. So forgotten to remember the history that we're forgetting, we need to search the accounts, the journals, the memoirs, and try to find literature about the past or the people that were not accounted for who lived that we know of. Because sadly, there's this part in history where we remember people not as people but as numbers. Like for example, if there are plagues, we remember them. Okay, like 5 lakh people died, or 10 lakh people died, or however many people died. So that's how we look at them. But if we are actually considering history, there is like people. When there are people involved, there are stories involved. So I'm sure there is a lot of literature and a lot of accounts of people who died or whose stories have been forgotten, which we can find and, dig deep in. And for the omitted section, I'd say, funnily enough, the political narratives of today shape the history of yesterday. So, whatever is important for a political party or for an agenda, whatever is normative, it is uh, that narrative uses history selectively. So they pick apart history like it's like they're a surgeon, and they pick things that they think would be useful in their narrative, and they only show those. So they highlight certain parts of history and they leave certain parts out. That is how they omit. And for cover up, I'd suggest there's this example of Kashmiri Pandits, how they have been tortured, and they have a similar situation to the Jews in the Holocaust, how they were, you know, taken out of their own homes, slaughtered. Yet the history in Jammu and Kashmir, it's so muddy that their struggle is often kept aside and not focused on that much. Also, how the Nazis destroyed a lot of documents after committing war crimes. So that is how they cover up history. And I don't know if you guys know this, but in Argentina, around I think 2 months ago, they found an 80-year-old box containing Nazi documents that were redacted, and it was in an Argentinian court archive. So that's how you can see, like, it's in Argentina, it's about Nazi, it's about Germany, but it's still covered up for 80 years. Nobody's looking at it. So there's a lot of history that we can look at, but we just need to know where to see.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I think history is all but a version of events, a different version of events, and everyone has their own version of history. And fortunately or unfortunately, what prevails, the popular narrative is always the narrative of the victors, like you had mentioned. And as a consequence of that, I think a lot of people's lives that are an active part of history over time become just a bunch of statistics, a bunch of numbers, and a lot of stories go unheard. So you're very right in talking about that when we're speaking about historical silences being forgotten, omitted, and a better version definitely, as you said, covered up. Thank you so much for that, Sujal. My next question would be to Aditi. Aditi, do you think history and silence in history can ever be ethical or necessary? And if so, when is omission a form of protection? And when do you think it can turn into complicity?
Thank you for asking this question, Sahasra. I'd like to start answering by drawing on True Yours concept of silencing the past. He contends that silence in history is never neutral. It is shaped by power, intention, and consequence. This is because power starts with altercating the narrative proper, as Sujil mentioned before, contributing to its creation and to its interpretation. But I also feel like silence can be an ethical and necessary form of protection at times. For example, when indigenous communities refuse to disclose their sacred histories to researchers to resist commodification and cultural extraction. So I think in these instances, silence acts as resistance and self preservation. However, when silence is imposed by dominant institutions such as states, courts, or media, it becomes a tool of complicity. I can cite some contemporary examples like the erasure of caste atrocities from Indian school textbooks, or the refusal to publicly release Form 17 data in recent Indian elections, or even the selective silence around the civilian toll in Gaza by global powers are not passive omissions, but active strategies that shield authority from accountability. On a similar note, the sanitization of slavery and colonial violence in Western curricula continues to obscure the structural roots of inequalities that prevail today. This is when omission turns into complicity. So I think silence in history can be both a shield and a weapon, but its ethical weight depends on who is silenced, who is silencing, and to what end.
That's, I think, wonderfully put. I think that really sums up whether and when history can be silenced ethically or necessarily. Thank you so much, Aditi. My next question is to Purvanshi. Purvanshi, how did Enlightenment rationality become a tool for epistemic violence in colonial India?
Hi. So, when talking about colonialism, we need to understand that it was much more than just territorial conquest. It was much more than just violence. It's something also very mental, right? I read, I think, what's the name of this book? I read Hind Swaraj for one of my courses, and Gandhi puts it very well that colonialism was this cognitive enslavement. If we trace back colonialism, it really is connected to the Enlightenment movement of Europe in the 18th century. And even though Enlightenment emphasized on, rationality over religious dogma, or equal rights, in fact, more focus on humanity, more focus on liberty and freedom. It also started to make divisions between cultures. So, how since the Europe started to develop with this Enlightenment movement, they seem to feel a superiority complex, which led them to classify others as subhuman cultures. So, and a lot of global South countries and, Africans, and basically the entire classification of races itself is something that comes out as a product of Enlightenment. So, when it comes to colonialism and how Enlightenment is something that we can trace back to when we talk about epistemic violence in India, it's about how, it's like they tried to know us, the British, because they wanted to impose that same rationality onto our lands that they found in theirs through this movement, and they ended up using rational sciences like anthropology to study our structures, right? And there are things like, oh, their heads are smaller, hence they are less intellectual than us, and so on and so forth. And they started classifying us on the basis of religion. I'm not saying that that did not exist earlier, but it was much more when the British came to India. And with this, and they also started to translate our texts. So they would spend a lot of time with priests, but they wouldn't actually allow the priests to translate it. They took it upon themselves to do so. And with that, they made them as laws for us because they thought, we've attained rationality and we have laws that govern us, and so shall the people of this land too. And so they took Vedas as, and like, the laws for Hindus, and they made laws for Muslims as well. They forgot to take into consideration that these texts were not, heart-boundly read and complied to by every part of India. So epistemic violence was very much based on knowing Indians through their own lenses, which has also sort of shaped our understanding of ourselves, right? So that's what I would say about that.
Absolutely. I think you're very right in saying that. Epistemic violence, and I think the origin of it in some senses can be traced back to a sort of Western reinterpretation of a lot of our scriptures, a lot of our traditions, cultures, and practices that have been followed for so long and that were the norm back pre-colonial era. And colonization definitely found a way of structurally and instrumentally and integrally changing all of these, that it's become so ingrained that even to this day a lot of Western ideals are preferred and they're seen as more appealing to the general public as opposed to something that's indigenous to our country. And if people were to subscribe to that ideology, then it's seen more as regressive, which is unfortunate, but it is definitely one of the consequences that we see in today's day and age because of Enlightenment rationality. Thank you so much for that, Purvanshi. My next question is again to Aditi. Aditi, what is the role of official commissions and fact finding in either upholding the truth or furthering erasure? Also, how would we interpret the label riot versus massacre in communal conflicts. What exactly do these terms erase, or on to the contrary, what do they emphasize?
Okay, so I think official commissions and fact-finding inquiries are often seen as instruments of justice, but in today's reality, they frequently serve to manage public outrage and shield the state rather than fully confront the truth of violence. In many communal conflicts, especially when the state itself is implicated, these processes become drawn out and opaque, offering legal formalities in place of real accountability. For instance, the case of 1987 Meerut violence, the PAC forces extrajudicially detained and executed nearly 100 of Muslim men. There was no explanation given other than framing the whole incident as communal riots between Hindu and Muslim forces. And there were um, years of silence and bureaucratic stalling and a delayed legal process that left the survivors and the families with no answers. The official response then, which was grounded in commissions and reports, ended up distancing the state from their responsibility, reducing a deeply targeted act to a matter of technical procedure. I also think that language plays a very crucial role here in this erasure. To call such violence a riot suggests chaos and mutual aggression, which blurs the lines between the victims and the perpetrators, masking the very intentional one-sided nature of the killings which happened in the incident. In contrast, I would say that the word massacre, which is more appropriate, forces us to confront the scale, the premeditation, and the structural backing of such acts. Uh, these aren't just semantic differences, they shape how violence is remembered, whose pain is acknowledged, and whether justice remains possibility for both Hindus and Muslims. In this sense, I think both official inquiries and the terms we use are not just passive reflections of the past, but these are active agents that continue to reproduce or shape how and whether that past is understood at all in today's reality.
Absolutely. I think you're so right in pointing out the role of language and numbers in fact-finding commissions and in when publishing reports, because at the end of the day, all that appeals to the larger public is probably the bigger numbers that are displayed, and what looks more attractive is what sells, and that inevitably becomes the truth. And so rightly pointed out about the language too, because I think it's a way of possibly subsiding the truth behind events, which then doesn't end up reaching the people. And in a way, it's probably a way of maintaining public order. But then, in effect, if you look at it, these fact finding commissions that are trusted to deliver reliable data just end up becoming an organ of the state to cover up mistakes, to cover up shortcomings. Say, for example, when there's evictions or displacement of so many communities, it's very easily and very conveniently worded as relocation, as if that was something that was planned all along. But the reality of the matter is much more different and much more harsh, which is so,
Exactly.
yeah, where I think the public gets desensitized to it when there's such numbing language used to describe events.
I think the point of contention becomes the source, like the official source that cites this information. We chose to believe that this source is more credible than the others, and we chose to believe that this is the truth. I think that is a bigger problem here because it's obviously how the state frames these incidents or any other important news as such, but it's also that public trust is much more embedded in these official reports and the commissionary findings, etc., which is kind of problematic.
Absolutely. I think the origin of these commissions and organizations brings with it an inherent credibility that is given to these, and the public trust in them only adds to that. So when their job, which is to deliver reliable, real data, takes a turn, it has an adverse effect, which I think not everyone is aware of. So thank you for bringing that up. My next question is to Apurva. Apurva, what do you think is the relationship between reclaiming erased queer histories and resisting contemporary political narratives that position queerness as Western?
I think reclaiming history in itself is a form of resistance. Like, um, so my article, which I've written for the blog, was talking about queer history in India. So now the colonial erasure enabled this modern homophobia that persists in India. Many contemporary Indian political and social narratives claim that queerness is a Western import and alien to Indian values. Now, this argument is usually used in state sponsored homophobia or moral policing and social exclusion. Now, this claim has no roots in actual Indian culture and it is in colonial era law, which we have seen in the section 377 of IPC. And this came from the Victorian morality and they deliberately erased India's indigenous gender and sexual diversity. Now, before colonialism, we had myths like the Ardhanadishwara, Shikandi, and stories of Sakis and Hijras, and all of these showed the fluid gender and same-sex love, which were acknowledged and often revered. Now, during colonialism, these narratives were suppressed, reinterpreted, and omitted from official histories. Now, like how Sujal was talking about omission and actively erased or mostly covered up, I think this is where it plays a very important role in finding that distinction between all of these terms, where these are usually covered up more than like actively erased because covered up gives them a more real like problem to the question. Now, when we are reclaiming these queer histories, uh, activists and scholars usually say that we need to find real imports that show that the queer is not actually uh, imported but actually Indian, and where we can find the hidden realities, which is from the temple carvings or classical literature. And this is used for restoring the cultural memory. And using this will directly undermine these political narratives that argue that queerness is from a corruption of Western values. And it becomes harder to demonize LGBTQ plus identities when they are seen to be having Indian roots from our own sacred texts or traditions and artistic heritage. I think also the resistance when it is historically grounded and in Indian culture and ideological culture, I think that's when I think particularly only in India it would have more of an effect and not us saying that oh like there are also people. I think showing that they have been uh, included in culture and history of India, and it was the British who submits them. I think that's when it'll give them more of a say. And I think, like Sujal and Purvanshi, all of you have been saying, it is Victor's justice at the end of the day. And who gets to define Indian culture today always depends on who controls its narrative. Reclaiming erased queer histories is in a way taking back that control. And it's not just correcting the past, it's also protecting the future generations and allowing the Indian queer people to see themselves as full participants in the Indian story and not as just outsiders.
Absolutely. I think this also ties back to the Enlightenment rationality that Purvanshi was talking about, where history has been reinterpreted and has been done so rigorously that we sort of start to believe that this is what it is. And it's sometimes, I think, interesting to think what would have followed and what would be the state of Indian society today in terms of how we would have interpreted and how we would have led with our own culture and our own practices if there was never the period of colonization, and how they would probably prevail today and shine. Thank you so much for that, Apurva. My next question is to Purvanshi. Purvanshi, how do political regimes decide which histories to remember and which to silence?
So, as the trajectory for this discussion is going, and as everyone has already mentioned about, how history is constructed based on who is in power, right? I would just like to point out that history is very much connected to the formation of nation state, and that's where a lot of things can come into perspective. So there's a differentiation between writing history of a region in general and then writing history of a nation state. Because with the formation of the nation state, you have concepts of us and them. So there's this othering that is involved, and that's why there's a certain image with nation. There is a certain image that comes to your mind. There's certain people who belong to it and certain people who don't belong to it, right? And I think how political regimes decide what to silence and what not to is, again, as Sujal had mentioned earlier, based on what would benefit them more. And I would just give, I think I have two examples at the back of my mind. One can be about how still, I think Aditi had mentioned this, but how still, students in UK are completely oblivious to the colonial history of the British Empire, and they haven't been taught about how detrimental it has been to former colonies. And I remember watching this debate on YouTube between like a couple of students. This is a very old debate. I think it's from 1980s or something. And there are like students from different countries, and there's a Indian student and there's a British student, and she's very shocked at how the Indian and the Pakistani students are reacting, or sort of the language that they're using when it comes to the British Empire, because they aren't taught about that history, because UK as it is, the construction of the nation, the construction of the British Empire that they wanted to show was one that was of a severe complex, right? And similarly, like how the ruling party in our country today feels that erasure of Mughal history from textbooks is a form of decolonization. But basically, it's just a sort of, you know, mission to reconstruct an image of India before all their invaders came in, so that they can sort of, promote their um, Hindutva or Hinduized version of India, which is no longer there, right? And what this does is that, see, these narratives, they're spread continually through education, through very subtle messaging all around us, to a point that we develop a sort of false consciousness about it, or there is a lot of internalization of ideas that goes within it, and we forget to question it and we accept them as truths. And I think when it comes to what is silenced and how it's decided, again it comes back to that nationhood, the connection with the nationhood. And I think it's very important to start questioning this, because I don't know, we won't be aware of half of the story if we don't, right?
Absolutely, you're so right. Even in the demarcation that you made in the different types of history that people are taught, I mean, there's a different version of the history that's taught to the essential perpetrator state, and a different version that's taught to the affected state or the victim party. I mean, it's honestly just surprising to see that there are people part of the world that come from perpetrating nations, and their version of history, they could have an honors in history and they haven't learned a word of colonial history. It's just surprising to see. And yeah, you're definitely right in saying that political regimes do have a huge impact on the history that is taught to students and the history that is publicized and promoted. And I think that's highly problematic, because we cannot pick and choose what is part of our history. What has gone down in history is inevitably there, and we must be aware of everything. And what we choose to subscribe to must be an active and informed choice made by us, and not something that's fed to us by any political regime. be it within India, outside, globally, whichever state we're talking about. So thank you for that, Purvanshi.
I
That's
just
My
why I
wanted to add.
believe that, like,
Go ahead, go ahead.
yeah,
I think Apiva was saying something.
Yeah, I was just trying to say, like, it's not even like different countries. Like, even if we see a particular country, the history books are changed when different parties come into play. I think we see that very clearly in India or even in the US right now with the Trump administration, like deleting chapters or like removing books in and of itself, like banning books from libraries. I think that's also like one of the examples that I could think of when she was speaking about it.
Absolutely. Purvanshi, were you saying something?
yeah, I was saying that in this context, it's more important to add history instead of remove it. I mean, even if you think like there are people who argue that, oh, we shouldn't be taught Mughal history because they're glamorized. Well, oh, it's okay if you believe in that, then like add more to it. If you think that we're not learning more about Indian kings, then add it. What's the point of removing it? We're not learning anything new.
True. That's so true. Um, my next question is to Sujal. How can historians and students act as memory workers to challenge hegemonic narratives?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Sasra. And first of all, I'd like to connect that with a few points that some of the other writers here mentioned. How Apurva mentioned beautifully, by the way, state-sponsored homophobia, and how the state acts as if Western ideas brought in, queerness. But in actuality, queer people have been around since the beginning of time. It's just something that we choose to not, accept. Because if you see, even in science, there are organisms that are asexual and that attract with, themselves. But for humans, we think, okay, no, now we have two very separate categories, and then in the middle, we tend to get muddy. If you see, there's a 2019 Yale study which shows that 83% of queer people all over the world are closeted. Now, if we take, let's say 10% of the whole world population is queer, so that makes it about 1 billion people. Now, I'm saying that's a huge number there, and it may be off, but I'm definitely sure that there's a large population there, and most of them who are not very comfortable. If you look at the Middle Eastern countries and even India now, no one is very comfortable coming out. There are a lot of cases of, people come out and then they're attacked. And secondly, in my March article, The Hidden Trailblazer of Indian Football, I mentioned the Matilda effect, in which women's contributions and women's writings are often not considered highly in history as compared to men. You would find a lot of male authors from old times and not a lot of women authors. So that's also something that needs to be, taken up by the historians and the students who will then become memory workers and try to look at, as I was in my previous question, how I answered, like try to look at the accounts and the journals of people who lived there and find out what they had to say about things. And also how Purvanshi mentioned nation state history and how to create a nation. There's a nationalist environment that is created in Beth Barron's book, Egypt as a Woman. She explains how to create a nationalist agenda and to join Egyptian Muslim communities against the British, who were the invaders. They decided to use the woman's body as a token for a nation. So they said, okay, so if British are invading Egypt, this is our motherland, so they're basically raping our daughters and our women. So this is an attack on our uh, it's a Urdu word, but it's called ird. So which it means that the women's body and it being harassed and it being attacked is it is somehow you know increased to include the whole nation. So like they're invading your women, so they're invading your nation. So now we have to connect and to join the tribes to do everything. So that's how they used it. So this is how this narrative is being shaped, and the people who are swept in it are not even by their choice. They need to be their accounts need to be studied in depth more because that's where the real history lies, not with the oppressors but with the oppressed. And the Yogendra Yadav was a speaker in April in our college, and he was promoting his book Making Sense of Indian Democracy. And in the book, he mentions how Indian political thought used to be very vibrant, very, you know, pragmatic, and very nuanced before the independence. And right after the independence, we sort of gave that up, and a lot of Indian modern political thinkers, in his words, uh, you know, died down or were not heard of anymore. And we shifted towards this perspective of Western ideologies where we were very concerned with what the Western media and what the West thought of us rather than what we thought of ourselves. Now, uh, there's an assistant professor in our college, Parth Nathani, who wrote a beautiful paper on academic integrity in this age of AI. And like I'm a fan of his work, and I've used it in a lot of places. Not to take anything away from him, but he recently sent a mail out where he said that his article got published in the Oxford University Press, and there was like a huge reaction there. So I'm not taking anything away from the reaction, but it just shows how we are so keen on getting validation from the West and how our perception of ourselves is determined by what they think of us. And in the question that you've put, Sahasra, it's what we need to do as memory workers is tackle the hegemonic narrative. So the hegemonic narrative is basically we are supposed to think what the West wants us to think, and to counter that, in Yogendra Yadav's book and how he mentions we need to reinvigorate our own thinking, our own thought. And first of all, that will start by reading books and articles in our own language, whether it be regional, whether it be Hindi, whether it be anything. Instead of getting, politically swayed by, okay, what are we reading? Like there are in Bangalore, there are Kannada versus Hindi debates going on, and like we're fighting amongst ourselves. Like we're supposed to be united here, and we are supposed to learn our own regional languages. Like how many people here know their own regional language and can write in it? Like not even speak, but write in it. So that's important because there's a lot of literature there that gets lost. We are studying in a English medium university where we're taught everything in English. Most of our material comes from people in English speaking countries. And I'm sure this goes for other ex colonized countries too. So, if we're brought up reading their literature and their work, so definitely we have a bias towards them. And to counter that bias, we need to learn our own language, read our own history, and read it in our words, in our language, because that makes a huge difference. If we read Indian accounts but we read them from a Britisher's perspective, that also skews our understanding of the topic a lot. So, yeah, that's how I feel. The memory workers here need to learn their own language, they need to study their accounts, their memoirs, and they need to find literature from the people who were oppressed. And that's how we can, come to a point where we are confident in ourselves and our history is determined by what our what happened in our past rather than thinking of what other people think of us, and that's very important.
That's, I think, wonderfully put, and I think you've covered quite literally every base. There's nothing to add on. But I would just like to harp on for a minute about how you spoke about reading people's journals and reading journals that are accounts and memoirs, essentially, of historical events. I think that is something definitely that's an active effort that people can make today, but also what happens in our day to day is something that we don't realize. Every act we do in some way or form is definitely going to be history at some point in the future. And I think the easiest way to do that is to find out is to just talk to people. People you're meeting for the first time, people who come from different places. When you go to a new place, speak to people, maybe try to learn a word or two of their language so you can communicate with them a bit easier and find out their story because that's a part of their history too. And maybe there's a larger story there than we ever think there is. So I think that's the easiest, most direct way that's at hand right now because we're all students and we're all at a part in our life where for internships or for work or for just vacations we travel a lot, and I think we all come from positions where we're able to travel a lot, and I think making use of that and is not only exploring the place in itself but also probably finding out the history of that place through the people and their stories and what they have to say about the place and how that place came to be and maybe how it is now. So I think that definitely forms an important part of history, and it's a great way to maybe change our perspective and things as well. And that's, I think, as authentic as it gets when it comes to history. Great. My last question for the day is to Apurva. Apurva, what is one historical silence that you believe urgently needs to be broken and why?
I think a lot of us covered a lot of different uh, types and instances where this has happened. But I think talking about India in particular, because that's what I researched about, I think the queer history and the suppression of Dalit voices or the indigenous voices in India in dominant historical narratives is very important. I think all of these are rooted in like structures of exclusion, and they're all central to reclaiming a more honest and an inclusive history of India. I think, like I mentioned, for centuries, Indian culture has been recognized and celebrated diverse gender expressions and sexual identities. And with the British colonial rule, this was taken out. And this was not only during the colonial past, but also extended towards when we got our independence. Even during contemporary political times, we still think it is a Western import. We still think that it is it came during the colonial time when that is not true. When it is that homophobia itself was introduced through colonial law and their religion. I think imposing all of that onto Indian culture was a way of them to impose their power, and reclaiming these histories will become a way to challenge both legal injustices that occurred to these people and also the cultural amnesia which has occurred. I think the marginalization of indigenous people in India, particularly Dalit, I think that is when most of the contemporary scholars talk about. Uh, these communities have historically been oppressed by the caste system, which is still prevalent. And I think people who think that the caste system is not prevalent are not uh, well educated enough to be able to understand the nuances that are present in the modern society. Because I think even people who say, for example, like the reservation system, people who say that it is not needed, I think, and that people misuse it. I think there's a reason why people are misusing it is because it is still a valued system and it is still necessary for the Indian public to be able to get those benefits. The reason it's misused is because the reservations are not done properly in the sense of uh, the standards aren't set properly, and that is also a problem because I think the privileged people, the privileged class, because class and class always coincide, the privileged class always has an upper hand. And now, when you are bringing caste into it, it also brings in the point of monetary value. And that's when people have a problem with it. And I think that's why the EWS section is a very good provision made by the government. I think stuff like that. And also, when we're talking about erasing history, or not even erasing, but misremembering history, because the Dalit leaders from the nationalist movement have had huge, powerful social reforms. For example, Dr. Ambedkar or Jyotira Phule or Savitribai Phule, they made such great social reforms in the Indian history, yet their ideas were like sidelined for national discourse for a long time because most of the other leaders were upper caste members and their narratives were always prevailed. And Dalit oral histories, poetry, cultural forms, they all are still underrepresented, even though they offer like a radical counter history, which I think even Sujal was talking about finding the oppressed uh, history and their journals and their narratives. I think this is one of the important forms because we still have them. They're still uh, like it's not like we have lost them in any sense. If we try hard enough, we can still find them. Oral histories for these communities are still present to this day, and finding it and breaking the silence is always important for the historical accuracy and for the justice and representation of these minority communities. I think since they have been deliberately erased to maintain power structures uh, in colonial or patriarchal or casteist or heteronormative systems, these silences have real world consequences even to this day as they shape the laws and the social norms and access to opportunities that all the communities to this day have. I think breaking these silences will restore the dignity that these communities hold historically and how they have been excluded from mainstream narratives. This will also expose how power manipulates history to control the present and the future, not only the past. And this will also give the future generations more inclusive truths, which I think is very important.
So that's why I could
That's
have.
wonderfully put. Yeah, just please go on.
Yeah, so like Apurva mentioned, very aptly, like how Dalit voices have been silenced in Indian history. Uh, Funnily enough, the British were the only one capable enough and who delivered on a caste census in 1931. And after that, India has not had a caste census. Now, something that is so prevalent, but statistics in, like, we talk about statistics, but the most important statistics have been left out. So before independence, this idea borrowed from a Kunal Kamra interview with Satish Deshpande, where Mr. Deshpande mentions how before the British, we practiced caste very openly because that's how the upper caste dominated and kept control over majority of the population, because upper caste is a very cream layer. Most of India is still in a very uh, caste ridden state. So in 1932, the British decided that since there are so many Dalits in population, they'll have a separate electorate for Dalits. And funny, it's ironic enough, but Mahatma Gandhi fasted unto death until this move was removed. So he said that it'll damage Hindus and it'll create a rift between the Hindu population. So they decided to do this. And after independence, we've seen to show ourselves in a world light as equal and people practicing equality. We started to hide caste, but we were still using it. And that's how the reservations came. And I'm sure a lot of people here might have read Kancha Ilaya's book, Why I'm Not a Hindu, and where he says how since the beginning of his life he's been shown that he's lower caste, and how his language is different, how the history he learns in his school is different, and how all of it really shapes his perspective, and how he can never be a Hindu, and how this narrative to include Dalits in Hindus is a very smart move by the people in power, but it is actually very damaging to our country. Even the Muslim population, a lot of them were the people who got converted. Even they they still are in lower caste, and the upper Muslim caste people, they also don't try to include them in it, because this is how this gap is maintained, this is how this power hierarchy is maintained. So again, uh, tying everything up, I think reading writings of people who have been oppressed is the best way to get ahead of this problem.
Absolutely right. I think that was a wonderful way to wrap things up. We've, through this discussion, a very fruitful discussion, I must say, we've covered literally all bases. And it's been a very engaging discussion. And I would like to thank you all for joining in and chiming in with your answers. It's it's been an honor. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.